Daughter of Dr. William A. Lummis, a man honorably distinguished in his profession, Elizabeth Fries Lummis was born at Sodus, a small town on the shores of Lake Ontario, in the state of New York in October 1818. Her father was a successful Philadelphia doctor who had purchased his estate on the shores of Lake Ontario from Sir Pulteney, to whom it had been granted by the British Crown. Her mother, Sarah Maxwell, and Lummis' second wife, was the daughter of General Maxwell, an officer in the American Revolutionary War. General Maxwell was born in Ireland but known as Scotch Willie. Thus he was the subject of this memoir. War in childhood imbued with patriotic feelings, which, next to the religious, are sure to nourish in the female mind the seeds of genius. Miss Lummis was early distinguished for vivacity of intellect and a thirst for learning, which her subsequent life shows was no evanescent fancy, but the natural stamp of her earnest mind. She was married, before she was 17, to Dr. William H. Ellet, an accomplished scholar, and then professor of chemistry in Columbia College, New York City, whither he removed his youthful bride. There she had such advantages of study as she had never before enjoyed, and her proficiency was rapid. She soon began to write for the periodicals. Her first piece, a poem, appeared in 1833 in the American Ladies Magazine, published at Boston. Her articles were favorably noticed, and the name of Mrs. Ellet became known among literary circles. She must have been a child prodigy, for when only 15 years of age she had a poem in the American Ladies Magazine, Boston, and the next year, 1834, a translation of Silvio Pellico's tragedy Euphemia of Messina. Elizabeth Ellet attended the girls' school in Aurora, New York, where she studied French, German, and Italian, among other subjects. In 1835 she published Poems, Original and Selected, and in the same year left the Auburn Female Seminary, which she was attending, to marry Dr. William H. Ellet, at that time professor of elementary chemistry at Columbia College. She was 17 and he was 29. She looked up to older men, doctors, like her father. Dr. William Henry Ellet was born in New York City, the 1st of November, 1806, died there, the 26th of January, 1859. He was 12 years Elizabeth's senior. He was graduated at Columbia in 1824, and subsequently, while studying medicine, gained a gold medal for a dissertation on the compounds of cyanogen. In 1830 he became lecturer on elementary chemistry in Columbia College, and 2 years later was promoted to the chair of that name, but in 1835 was made professor of chemistry, mineralogy, and geology in South Carolina College. For his discovery of a new and cheap method of preparing gun cotton, the legislature of South Carolina presented him with a service of silver plate. Gun cotton, or nitrocellulose, would be used to print movies decades later. In 1848 he returned to New York, and in 1854 became consulting chemist of the Manhattan Gas Company, which office he held until his death. After her husband accepted the position of professor of chemistry, mineralogy, and geology in South Carolina College, they moved to Charleston, where they remained until 1849, when they returned to New York. Professor Ellet died in 1859 at the age of 53. There is an Ellet Memorial Hospital in Missouri founded by a William H. Ellet in 1935, but this man lived decades after Elizabeth's husband, and I could find no clear connection between them. Mrs. Ellet continued her contributions to the periodicals, including Godis Lady's Book, the North American Review, Glisson's Literary Companion, and the Southern Quarterly Review, but also published books on a great variety of subjects. The following is not a complete list of her publications, but is given to show her versatility. Teresa Contami, A Tragedy, 1835, Scenes from the Life of Joanna of Sicily, 1840, Characters of Schiller, 1842, The Women of the American Revolution, 1848-50, Family Pictures from the Bible, 1849, Evenings at Woodlawn, A Collection of German Legends and Traditions, 1850, Domestic History of the American Revolution, 1850, Watching Spirits, 1851, Pioneer Women of the West, 1852, Novelettes of the Musicians, 1852, Summer Rambles in the West, 1853, The Practical Housekeeper, A Cyclopedia of Domestic Economy, 1857, Women Artists in All Ages and Countries, 1861, The Queens of American Society, 1867, and Court Circles of the Republic, 1869. In 1834, appeared her translation of Euphemia of Messina, one of the most admired productions of Silvio Pellico, and in the following year, an original tragedy from her pen, Teresa Contarini, was successfully represented in New York, and also in some of the western cities. In the same year, 1835, she published her Poems, translated and original. For several succeeding years, Mrs. Ellet wrote chiefly for periodicals. To the American Review, she contributed papers on Italian tragedy, Italian poets, Lamartine's poems, Andreni's Adam, etc. Ellet's old love of literature remained unchanged in South Carolina. Besides contributing to the North American Review, Southern Quarterly Review, The Lady's Book, and other periodicals, in 1841 she produced The Characters of Schiller, an analysis and criticism of the principal persons in Schiller's plays, with an essay on Schiller's genius, and translated extracts from his writings. Joanna of Sicily was her next work, soon followed by Country Rambles, a spirited description of the scenery she has observed in her journeyings through the United States. She was mentioned by Poe in his work Literary Criticism 1846. This was published when she was more than 10 years in her marriage, and you'd think she would just let it go. But The Raven made Poe a literary celebrity, and Ellet had been celebrated her whole life, so any criticism must have stung. Some of Poe's radical insights into poetry and criticism are expressed in his essay The Philosophy of Composition, 1846, which purports to explain the origins of his own poem The Raven. Other critical essays include The Poetic Principle and The Rationale of Verse. Poe believed his role as a critic included exposing poor writing and demanding that American writers meet higher standards. His critical reviews often included a detailed technical examination of the work at hand, and his observations ranged from pointing out grammatical errors to exposing illogical reasoning. Resettling in New York City in 1845 while her husband remained in the South, Elizabeth Ellet began to compose flirtatious letters to Edgar Allan Poe, thus competing with poet Francis Osgood for his affections. She also spread rumors that Poe and Osgood, both of whom were married, were engaged in an illicit affair, and Osgood should return her love letters to Poe since she supposedly saw them on a visit to Osgood's house, though her gossip-mongering came to an end when Osgood's husband threatened her with a libel suit and her own husband joined her in New York. She already had managed to incur permanent damage to Francis Osgood's reputation and the life of Poe. Poe insisted Ellet wouldn't stop her poison pen letters, and his wife Virginia Eliza named Ellet as her murderer on her 1847 deathbed. You can learn more about Poe and his mother-in-law in their videos on this channel. The rumors from 1845 are mentioned in the 6th letter Poe wrote to his beloved and future betrothed Sarah Helen Whitman in 1848. This letter was reprinted by the University of Virginia on the centennial of Poe's death, and you can buy it in the Last Letters of Edgar Allan Poe to Sarah Helen Whitman. It was nice to see the University of Virginia publishing critical American work such as this instead of its Marxists, or communists whining and complaining about the wonderful history of Virginia. In this letter, Poe refers to Ellet as Mrs. E. You allude to your having been tortured by reports which have all since been explained to your entire satisfaction. On this point my mind is fully made up. I will rest neither by night nor by day until I bring those who have slandered me into the light of day, until I expose them, and their motives to the public eye. I have the means, and I will ruthlessly employ them. On one point let me caution you, dear Helen. No sooner will Mrs. E. hear of my proposals to yourself, than she will set in operation every conceivable chicanery to frustrate me, and, if you are not prepared for her arts, she will infallibly succeed, for her whole study, throughout life, has been the gratification of her malignity by such means as any other human being would die rather than adopt. You will be sure to receive anonymous letters so skillfully contrived as to deceive the most sagacious. You will be called on, possibly, by persons whom you never heard of, but whom she has instigated to call and vilify me without even their being aware of the influence she has exercised. I do not know anyone with a more acute intellect about such matters as Mrs. Osgood, yet even she was for a long time completely blinded by the arts of this fiend, and simply because her generous heart could not conceive how any woman could stoop to machinations at which the most degraded of the fiends would shudder. I will give you here but one instance of her baseness, and I feel that it will suffice. When, in the heat of passion, stung to madness by her inconceivable perfidy, and by the grossness of the injury which her jealousy prompted her to inflict upon all of us, upon both families, I permitted myself to say what I should not have said. I had no sooner uttered the words than I felt their dishonor. I felt, too, that, although she must be damningly conscious of her own baseness, she would still have a right to reproach me for having betrayed, under any circumstances, her confidence. Full of these thoughts, and terrified almost to death lest I should again, in a moment of madness, be similarly tempted, I went immediately to my secretary, when these two ladies one went away, made a package of her letters, addressed them to her, and with my own hands left them at her door. Now, Helen, you cannot be prepared for the diabolical malignity which followed. Instead of feeling that I had done all I could to repair an unpremeditated wrong, instead of feeling that almost any other person would have retained the letters to make good, if occasion required, the assertion that I possessed them instead of this, she urged her brothers and brother-in-law to demand of me the letters. The position in which she thus placed me you may imagine. Is it any wonder that I was driven mad by the intolerable sense of wrong? If you value your happiness, Helen, beware of this woman. She did not cease her persecutions here. My poor Virginia, who was continually tortured, although never deceived, by her anonymous letters, on her deathbed declared that Mrs. E. had been her murderer. Have I not a right to hate this fiend and to caution you against her? You will now comprehend what I mean in saying that the only thing for which I found it impossible to forgive Mrs. O. was her reception of Mrs. E. Be careful of your health, dearest Helen, and perhaps all will yet go well. Forgive me that I let these wrongs prey upon me. I did not so bitterly feel them until they threatened to deprive me of you. I confess, too, that the insults of your mother and sister still rankle at my heart, but for your dear sake I will endeavor to be calm. Interested in the roles and accomplishments of early American women, Elizabeth Ellet's most notable literary contributions were her popular historical accounts of women's participation in the American Revolution and in the settling of the Western frontiers. You can read her The Women of the American Revolution for free on archive.org. Though these written histories idealized a humble image of femininity, they were the very first to recognize the contributions of women to the formation of the United States. In the autumn of 1848, her most elaborate, as well as important work, was published in New York, The Women of the American Revolution, in 2 volumes, to which she added a third. This contribution to American history, and the ability with which it was executed, has, deservedly, given Mrs. Ellet a high place among female writers. In 1850, she published Domestic History of the American Revolution, in 1 volume, designed to exhibit the spirit of that period, to portray, as far as possible, the social and domestic condition of the colonists, and the state of feeling among the people during the war. Another work of hers, Pictures from Bible History, was also published in 1850. She was an established, mature author when she turned her attention to domestic management and wrote The Practical Housekeeper, 1857. She announced in the preface, no complete system of domestic economy, within the limits of a convenient manual, has been published in this country. Convenient manual was possibly a criticism aimed at Catherine Beecher, whose weighty domestic manuals, which were nothing if not complete, were appearing throughout the 1840s and 50s. Try as she may have to make her manual more convenient, The Practical Housekeeper still totaled 600 pages, and is filled not only with domestic advice, but also with references to philosophers, modern scientists, and ancient civilizations. True to its title, however, the encyclopedic guide is extremely well organized, breaking down domestic economy into 3 parts: housekeeping, cooking, and drugstore-type concerns, soaps, perfumes, medical guide. Mrs. Ellet tried nearly all varieties of literature, original and translation, poetry, essay, criticism, tragedy, biography, fiction, history, and stories for children and poison pen letters. To say, as we truly can, that she has not failed in any, is sufficient praise. Still she has not, probably, done her best in any one department. The concentration of genius is one of the conditions of its perfect development. She was young, hopeful, and studious. Nor are her accomplishments confined to the merely literary. In music and drawing she also excels, and in the graces that adorn society, and make the charm of social and domestic intercourse, she was eminently gifted. Her residence was fixed in the city of New York. Having lived in a southern state and seeing slavery firsthand, she downplayed the overdramatic or false accounts of it in the North. She accepted women's traditional roles as mother and housekeeper, even as she recognized the need to record women's deeds and words as part of American history. She herself rejected these roles, however, and preyed upon the Poes wherever they lived. One wonders how she found Poe's address, if it was published alongside his name in his work. Mrs. Ellet had no children of her own, but promoted charities for impoverished women and children, speaking in public to raise funds. An Episcopalian most of her life, she converted to Catholicism in her later years. She died in New York City on June 3, 1877.